Well, hello, and welcome again to our latest presentation in this ongoing series, AP United States History and You. Today's presentation has the long and unwieldy title, The Decline and Fall of Colonial Relations with Great Britain. Not surprisingly, it will cover a lot of ground in a relatively short period of time, so it will be important for you to improve your academic efficiency. You might be asking yourself, self? What is this so-called academic efficiency and how can I practice it? Well, it's pretty simple and it starts with taking great notes. By now, you've gotten a bit of a sense of how this class runs and how important it is to take great notes, both when we're together in class and when you're at home with your new best friend, the textbook, or when you're in study hall watching a video presentation like this one at 1.5 speed. The format and delivery might be different, but the skills are the same. So you need to monotask, which means remove all distractions like phones and cats and little brothers. That way, it's easier for you to distinguish between signal and noise. That is the difference between the information that you'll be tested on and random side comments on or Mr. Laskowski's feeble attempts at humor. Third, you will want to focus on what you choose to write down and why you choose to write it down. Essentially, your pen is your filter. If you're using a pencil, your pencil is your filter. But your writing implement is how you decide what is worth remembering and what is not. And the key here is writing more than just the words you see on the screen, because that's the difference between a skeleton and a living, breathing, functioning body. Lastly, I want you to see the big picture. Taking notes isn't just a hurdle to jump over for this part of Module 1.2. It will be a resource for you as you complete your homework assignments and study for your next test whenever that comes. In short, taking great notes now pays big dividends later. I'll say that again for effect. Taking great notes now pays big dividends later. Okay, Lau, let's just jump right in. If you are observant, you've probably noticed that this is a new slideshow, which means that this is technically Unit 2. However, in truth, everything we talk about in this presentation is actually background information, setting us up to talk about the 7 Years' War, which is the true beginning of Unit 2. So think of these next couple of minutes as Advanced Placement Unit 2, if you will. So the first thing we need to address is mercantilism and how it influenced the development of the English colonies in America. But what, you ask, is mercantilism? Well, for our own purposes, we can define mercantilism as a system whereby a country's economic power is determined by the amount of money, specifically gold and silver, that a country is able to amass. And that makes sense because nations that want to go up the land money power spiral both need money and they try to get money for their colonial ventures. This explains why so much of Spain's focus was on accumulating gold from her colonies, and why England sought to make as much money as possible off of their colonies. Now, here is something pretty obvious about mercantilism. To accumulate more gold and silver, a country needs to maintain a favorable balance of trade. That is, a country must export more than it imports, so that it has more profits than expenses. So countries always wanted to keep their own costs as low as possible so that they could maximize profits on the products that they sell to other countries. And so seen in this light, perhaps it's obvious why the king looked favorably upon southern plantation colonies like Virginia and the Carolinas, but didn't have many nice things to say about those tiny religious colonies like Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay, which didn't grow cash crops, but still found time to complain about the crown. But remember, the colonies were a source of raw materials for England, whether it was tobacco in Virginia or rice and indigo in Carolina. And because England wanted to maximize its profits, that meant it needed to make sure that it kept its own costs down, which meant spending less to get those raw materials so that they could make more money selling the finished products. In essence, this is like the Starbucks business model. A cup of coffee costs about 25 cents to produce or so, but if you can convince people to pay 5 or 6 or $7 for it, then you can earn 4, 5 or $6 of profit. You pay less, you charge customers more, and you pocket the difference. The way England did this was by instituting what were called the Navigation Acts. These were a series of bills designed to rig the colonial trade system and ensure a favorable balance of trade for England. These acts were imposed on the colonies roughly around the time of the Glorious Revolution in the 1680s and 90s, all the way through the 7 Years' War in the 1750s. And they were designed to set rules for navigation to ensure a favorable balance of trade. For instance, ships transporting goods from the colonies often had to be English ships, meaning they were owned by English traders. And they had to use English crews, and sometimes they had to go through an English port first, even if the goods were being traded with other countries. These rules guaranteed profits for English ship owners, or crews, or harbor masters, which meant more money ending up in England. Mercantilism. One of the navigation acts that caused the greatest commotion was the one that announced the enumerated articles. That is a numbered list of specific products that could only be traded with England. Well, this list included virtually every cash crop that the colonies produced, including tobacco, indigo, rice, and naval stores. So why does this matter? Well, it matters because colonies could only trade their products with England, even though other countries wanted these colonial products and might even pay higher prices for them. But by shutting out those other countries out of the market, it essentially forced colonies to accept whatever low price English merchants wanted to pay. And of course, if you remember, the goal is for the country to pay as little as possible for these raw materials. And so the merchants made lowball offers to the colonists because they knew that they were the only game in town. And so this is what we call a buyer's market. The buyer sets the price, and then the buyer also holds the power. Well, the Navigation Acts, especially the enumerated articles, were predictably unpopular amongst American colonists. Essentially, plantation owners complained that we're doing all the work, but you're reaping all of the profits, which would probably have been a better argument if it weren't for the fact that it was enslaved people who were doing all the work, and the plantation owners were reaping all of the profits, such as they were. There's an irony there. I hope you picked up on it. But given this economic reality in which farmers couldn't make money, or at least much money, working within the system put in place by the Navigation Acts, they often had two options. One, just stop farming, which would hurt both the landowners and England too, because the access to cheap raw materials would disappear. Or two, they could evade the Navigation Acts and smuggle their products to other countries that were willing to pay higher prices. Higher risk, but higher reward. And so perhaps it's not surprising that many landowners turned to smuggling. What is curious is how England reacted to this smuggling. And at this point, I'll start referring to the English as the British, because England and Scotland merged in 1707 to form Great Britain. Essentially, Parliament, and here I'm saying Parliament because remember it's after the Glorious Revolution, and so the king has become just a figurehead, and Parliament has all of the real power. Parliament reacted to this smuggling by instituting a policy called salutary neglect. By the way, another great band name you might wish to consider. Salutary neglect is defined as the intentionally lax enforcement of a law, in this case, the Navigation Acts. Well, you might ask, why pass a law if you're not going to enforce it? That is a good question. But remember the two options that landowners had. Either they could stop producing or they could smuggle. If they stopped producing, then England couldn't maintain its favorable balance of trade. So we needed to protect against that at all costs. So go ahead and have the Navigation Acts, but only loosely enforce them. The result is that some people will smuggle, surely, but enough will follow the rules, either because they're rule followers or because they're afraid of being caught, so that farms are still producing and England is still able to maintain its favorable balance of trade. If you need an example, think of a dress code. If a school has such a rigid dress code that students get expelled upon their first offense, well, that school would probably lose enrollment or go out of business. However, if the dress code were non-existent, such that people might show up to school naked or in their undergarments, well, then parents might decide to pull their children out of such an environment, which would also be bad for enrollment. So instead, we might have something approaching salutary neglect, whereby we have a rule and most people follow it, and we only have to occasionally enforce it. And in that way, enrollment remains high. Okay, now for the payoff. Salutary neglect essentially enabled colonists to smuggle, to break the law, without much real fear of being caught. And this is important because the longer that people got away with something, even if it's illegal, the more they will begin to think of it as their natural right. I'm going to say that again for effect. The longer that people get away with something, even if it's illegal, the more they will begin to think of it as their natural right. So imagine this scenario. You walk into the Raven Zone and steal a shirt. First of all, shame on you, honor code. But if you get away with it, then you might be tempted to try it again and again and again. Or if you park in the senior lot and you get away with it, you're more likely to do it again. And if, after getting away with it time after time after time, you eventually get caught, you might feel that your natural rights were being taken away. It's not your natural right, of course, but it feels that way, and then you're going to go get indignant. How dare you enforce a rule that I've been breaking all year? Let's rebel. Hold on to that thought, because we'll revisit it later in this unit. Here's a slide I added just to put a mercantilist spin on something you already know about: the conversion to the labor system of race-based slavery. Plantation owners, like the mother country, wanted to minimize their own expenses and maximize their profits. So that might help explain why landowners started by relying on cheap indentured servants, essentially hired help at first. But as you will remember, with higher life expectancy, problems stemming from troublemakers like Nathaniel Bacon, and the emergence of a global industry built around enslaving people and transporting them to the New World, plantations began bringing in more and more enslaved people. And the result was a steady labor supply with lower production costs. And so here again, we will make a conscious choice not to address the fundamental immorality of slavery, not just yet. And we're also not going to consider the tremendously physical, emotional, social, and economic wounds that slavery would cause, wounds that still haven't healed. Just know that they're there. They're always still there. Okay, enough about economics. Let's focus on the shooting. You'll see that as England, later Great Britain, emerged as a colonizing power, it brought them into conflict with other nations that were jockeying for position on the land money power spiral. First up, the Dutch. Really? Yes, really. The Netherlands started colonizing the New World at the beginning of the 1600s. You might remember that New York City used to be called New Amsterdam, and that the Hudson River was named for the first explorer who claimed the land, for Holland. And areas like Brooklyn and the Bronx and Harlem were originally Dutch words. But with English colonies emerging to the north and to the south of them, New Netherland quickly found itself surrounded by competitors, both in terms of commercial trade and in their most lucrative business, the slave trade. Across 20 years, in the middle of the 17th century, the English and Dutch had several skirmishes, the last of which resulted in the transfer of all Dutch colonies into English hands, and the creation of New York and the growth of English domination on the East Coast. After the defeat of the Spanish Armada, Spain, let's remember, remained the single most powerful colonizer in the New World, and its vast holdings in Central and South America, not to mention Spanish Florida, kept it at the top of the list. You will recall that it was fear of Spanish aggression that caused England to add its first layer of bubble wrap, which of course was Carolina, and then a second layer of bubble wrap that was Georgia. And eventually, you knew that these two sides would renew their rivalry, and they did in a short war that took place along the Georgia coast starting in 1739. How and why? Well, it's a strange story. And apparently, there had been an altercation between a Spanish and British ship decades earlier. And in the scuffle, the English captain, whose name was Jenkins, had his ear unceremoniously chopped off. Now, nothing came of that skirmish, but, true story, the English saved the ear that had gotten chopped off and they put it in a box. And decades later, when trying to justify a war with the Spanish, someone brought out the old box and held up Jenkins' ear for everyone in Parliament to see. First of all, gross. Must have looked like an old rotting piece of beef jerky, but whatever, it was enough to incense the British. And so this conflict off the coast of Georgia is officially called the War of Jenkins' Ear. So there's that. Well, the war didn't really accomplish anything except to heighten the antagonism between the Spanish and Great Britain. But let's take note of that asterisk here, because it's meaningful. We're going to see that antagonism flare up again really soon. Well, if you've been looking for the biggest and baddest rivalry around, it is the British and the French. On the whiteboard in room 296, you will see great historical truth number one. The French and the British hate each other. Always have, always will. Like the Yankees and the Red Sox, or the Tar Heels and the Blue Devils. How far back does this date? Well, probably 1066 with the Norman Conquest. And it's endured for a millennium. Anytime there was a war, England and France would always be on opposite sides. Sure, they joined together to be on the same side in World War I and World War II, but that does tell you something. Only Germany can make these sworn enemies join forces. And then only temporarily, because then they went right back to hating each other. Side note, you might find that you're naturally an Anglophile, someone who loves Britain, or a Francophile, someone who loves France. These two types of people rarely get along with each other, which is why we have a two-party system today. Thomas Jefferson loved France. Alexander Hamilton loved Britain. Jefferson and Hamilton hated each other. By the way, I have a similar theory about pets. Some people are dog people, and some people are cat people. Those that who say they are both should really just make up their mind. I always like to say that Anglophiles are usually dog lovers and Francophiles are usually cat lovers. It's not always true, but it does make sense. Dogs are loyal and dependable, like the British, who are America's closest ally. Meanwhile, cats are bony and aloof and incapable of love, like the French. Sorry to any French people watching here, much love and respect. But during the colonial era, while the English were settling the colonies we've mentioned, the French had established holdings down around New Orleans and up the Mississippi, but more importantly, along the St. Lawrence River in modern-day Canada. Given their natural rivalry, perhaps it isn't surprising to learn that the British and the French sought to expand their colonies, and as they sought to do so, they inevitably came into conflict with each other, and they would end up fighting 3 wars against each other in a 50-year time period. Well, they didn't fight directly, exactly. Sure, there were some European soldiers on both sides, but in truth, these wars were an example of what we call proxy fighting. in which Native Americans stood in as proxies on both sides of the fight. Essentially, Native Americans hired by the British fought against Native Americans hired by the French. And usually these tribes were already enemies, and the additional money and weapons from Europe just encouraged them to fight each other. But it really didn't change much. The First War, which we often call King William's War, accomplished precisely nothing. A few years later, a new proxy war broke out, and after 11 years of fighting in what would be called Queen Anne's War, the British actually made some gains. They earned undisputed claims to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia and the area around Hudson Bay. And that's not nothing. And a couple of years later, the two sides would fight again in another feudal war called King George's War, which also accomplished nothing. But you'll notice the little asterisk there after that last war. That's my way of saying that William and Anne and George's War, WA&G, the WAG Wars if you prefer, they set the scene for what would be the battle royale between Britain and France, with one last no-holds-barred cage match to determine supremacy in North America. Cue the wrestling music. That battle royale would be known in America, at least, as the French and Indian War, and in the rest of the world, known as the 7 Years' War, which was rooted in the 700-year-long rivalry between the English and the French, but its most direct cause was the battle for supremacy in the Ohio country, a blob of land surrounding the Ohio River. It was a major waterway that opened the door to the west because it emptied into the vast Mississippi River. And so whichever country captured the Ohio country would essentially control access to everything in the west. Well, both Britain and France seem to recognize the significance of the Ohio country at the precisely same time, and they both moved to conquer it. And to do so, French needed to move south in order to expand, and the British needed to move west. And they realized this at, as I say, the exact same moment that whoever is going to control the Ohio River and the Ohio country would control access to Mississippi River and everything else beyond. Essentially, call the shots in the New World, or at least North America, from that point on. The Ohio country was just that important. And so, like in some movie fight scene, where both the people who have been fighting against each other, they suddenly catch sight of a gun lying on a nearby table. In the movie, everything sort of happens in slow motion. Their eyes move toward the gun on the table, and then those eyes grow wide as both bodies lunge toward the gun and toward each other, knowing that whoever got there first would win, and whoever got there second would probably go home in a body bag. So what was the gun in this scenario? The place in western Pennsylvania where the Allegheny River joined the Monongahela River to form the Ohio River, modern-day Pittsburgh. But don't let me spoil the ending for you. While it's true that the British did get there first and start building a fort, they were quickly pushed out by a group of French soldiers who then finished the fort and named it Fort Duquesne. And that might have ended things. But the British weren't going to give up so easily, so they looked around for a qualified soldier to lead troops up against the French, and when they couldn't find anyone qualified, they turned to George Washington, 22-year-old George Washington. Really? Well, as it happened, Washington, who was a surveyor for the British military, was in the vicinity, and because the northwestern border of his home in Virginia was at the time the Ohio River, it very much was Virginia's business whether or not the French would be expanding down along the Ohio River and into the Ohio country. So Washington accepted the challenge and took some men to drive the French out of Fort Duquesne. Wonder how it went. Not well. Washington and his men were driven back, and then out of necessity, they built a fort called Fort Necessity, and then they chose to attack the French in the field again, where the British lost, and George Washington himself was captured. And at gunpoint, Washington was forced to sign a confession in French, which he could not read. And this is why history has forgotten the name George Washington. Actually, for fans of the musical Hamilton, what happened in Western Pennsylvania explains why in the show Washington says, I was younger than you are now when I was given my first command. I led my men into a massacre. I witnessed their deaths firsthand. Indeed, Washington was lucky to escape with his life, and he knew that from there on in, history had its eyes on him. And as if to punctuate that point of just how humiliated Washington had been when he was captured by the French, I found this little mannequin at the Pittsburgh History Museum, and it seems to perfectly capture Washington's despair at the situation. Not exactly the figure you're going to see on the $1 bill, is it? But this image is both accurate and meaningful, because when Washington finally did report just how rudely he had been treated by the French, that was more than enough to convince Parliament that it was time for another war with the French. After all, these two sides don't need much encouragement to fight. And so began, at long last, the Battle Royale, the fight for supremacy in the New World. And in fact, the fight would be a true world war, fought in colonies from America to the Pacific. Everywhere but here, they called this war the 7 Years' War. But here in America, it was called the French and Indian War because the two main enemies were, wait for it, the French and most, but not all, of the Native American tribes. Not all, I say, because some, most notably the Iroquois, sided with the British. But most native tribes took a look at the French and then looked at the British and decided that the British were indeed the bigger threat. And so they sided with the French. It was a fateful decision, indeed. Spain actually later joined the war on the French side, as they were still salty about the whole War of Jenkins' Ear thing and maybe even the defeat of the Spanish Armada. So, how did this war go? Well, it's complicated. At first, the British couldn't seem to buy a victory, and the French Native American alliance seemed unstoppable. By 1758, it looked like the French would win, and that the British colonies might eventually be conquered one by the French. Sacre bleu! But all of that changed with the arrival of William Pitt. This member of Parliament rose to prominence during the war by arguing that winning the war was a matter of life and death for Great Britain, and that it needed to go all out for victory, even if that meant amassing a huge, huge debt. So, faced with the prospect of losing the war and maybe its entire empire, Great Britain started spending and spending and spending on troops, supplies, weapons, training, whatever it took. And it worked. In short order, the British seized Fort Duquesne, rechristening it Fort Pitt, see where the name comes from now, and attacking the French in Quebec. In addition, the British captured the Spanish colonies of Cuba and the Philippines, arguably the two most lucrative Spanish colonies. Now, remember this moment. Britain now has Cuba. Or because I always hear the voice of President Kennedy every time I see the name Cuba, I pronounce it as he did, Cuba. Well, eventually, Cuba will come to be like an ideal, a dream, like a boy or a girl we have a crush on, but who is totally, totally out of our league. So close and yet so far, so near, and yet it is just never, never going to happen. Oh, Cuba. By the time the war ended, a couple of important things had happened. First, take note of the fact that it's the year 1763. That's a year you should know, and maybe you even remember it from a little bit earlier in the semester. But the treaty that ended the war, the Treaty of Paris of 1763, it essentially kicked the French out of North America for good. Britain ended up getting all the land east of the Mississippi River, basically all of New France, and it also got Spanish Florida. What? How did that happen? Well, as it turned out, the British decided that they would rather have Florida than Cuba, and so they made a deal to give Cuba and the Philippines back to Spain in exchange for Florida. Wait, we gave away Cuba, the dream, the unattainable love, and you gave it away for Florida? I will never get over that. Okay, but what about the Native Americans? Well, no one told them that the war was over, and many kept on fighting, especially a leader named Pontiac, who led a rebellion called, fittingly, Pontiac's Rebellion, which lasted all the way up until the British made peace by making the Proclamation of 1763, which established the Proclamation Line of 1763, which is the red squiggle you see on this map here. And the line essentially said, you colonists stay on your side of the line, and you Native Americans stay on your side of the line. And if you do, we'll never need to have any more of your land ever. Asterisk. Until we decide we need your land. But what this did was secure peace between Britain and the Native American tribes. And even though it really irritated colonists who hated the fact that they had just gotten all of this beautiful new land, but were suddenly not allowed to go there. It's like if your parent bought you a beautiful new car and said you could never drive it ever, or sit in it, or look at it. In fact, forget about the car. So, big picture time. Why is 1763 important? Well, because it's the end of the 7 Years' War, sure, and it's when the Proclamation Line secured a temporary peace with Native American tribes. But it also represented the end of French colonization in North America. And it also represented the missed opportunity for the British to own Cuba. And perhaps most importantly, it's the moment when Great Britain moved past the Spanish to become the #1 world power. After 1763, Great Britain was, at last, truly great. But all that power came at a cost, a huge cost, as it turned out. The war debt that Britain amassed in order to win the war amounted to thousands and thousands of bills that all came due as soon as the war was over. And guess who would be asked to pay for those bills? American colonists. But that, my friends, is the story for another slideshow. For now, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in class. Is everyone else gone? Okay, here's a bonus track. Okay, back when CDs came out back in the 80s, artists often added a secret bonus song and a bonus track at the end of a record. It was kind of a reward for making it through the album, establishing a special connection between the band and their fans. And it's in that spirit I offer this bonus track. Enlightenment, thought, and pietism. Please control your excitement. But it actually does make a lot of sense to talk about these two things at this precise moment, as Great Britain and her colonies are dealing with the repercussions of a world war and the fact that the mother country has become a superpower with a monumental amount of debt. And it will be especially rewarding for students who've been longing for the good old days of AP Euro or AP World or even ninth grade world history. So here goes. One of the questions that often comes up is the extent to which Enlightenment thought made it across the ocean and into the minds of colonists. The answer is, it's complicated. But a couple of factors certainly helped to spread the word. And the first is the so-called print revolution that ensured that the ideas of the Enlightenment could be printed and spread cheaply and quickly to readers everywhere. Add to that the innovations in transportation, especially in shipping, that took place in the 17th and 18th centuries, and those books and the ideas in them could make their way to America in just a number of weeks. But what were those ideas and why did they matter? Well, in short, regardless of their beliefs about the nature of man and society, most philosophers certainly agreed that the world makes sense, and that through careful study and inquiry, anyone can learn the great truths of the world. Science and math were what mattered. They still do. The objective and the provable, not mysticism and emotionalism. Science, math, logic, the objective and the provable. And most importantly, the reasonable. And it was only reasonable to think that all of creation was governed by certain universal laws, like gravity. And because they were universal, these laws should apply everywhere, both in England and America, to members of parliament and to citizens of Virginia, or maybe Georgia, or even Pennsylvania. What was not reasonable was to think that certain people should have more rights or powers just because they were on one side of an ocean than the other. And so suddenly the notion of treating colonists fairly and equally was seen as little more than obeying the laws of nature, right? The natural laws of the universe. And so if Parliament were to treat colonists differently, less than, then Parliament itself was violating these Enlightenment principles and violating the laws of nature. And I should mention here that many philosophers, including our own Benjamin Franklin, subscribed to the idea that the only religion that could stand up to the scrutiny of reason was something called deism, the belief that a God force created us, which only stood to reason because we exist, and so therefore we had to have been created by something, somehow. But it was this same creator God, this God force, did not and would not listen to a person's prayers now that the work of creation was done. And that God would certainly not answer prayers or otherwise intervene into the lives of people, which meant that deists essentially believed that the God force had simply wound the clock and is no longer interested in human affairs. And that, of course, has an implication for organized religion, because deists effectively denied the divinity of Jesus, because in their minds, God fathering a child didn't make 100% of sense logically, and it certainly wasn't scientifically provable. And nor did having that person's eventual death absolve believers of their sin. That didn't make sense to the deists. These things were viewed as unscientific and therefore little more than guesses or wishful thinking. And while the ideals of the Enlightenment would certainly inform the beliefs of the founding fathers, look no further than the Declaration of Independence to see Jefferson's shameless adoption of John Locke's philosophies of government. Something else was going on in the middle of the 18th century. It was the rise of pietism, that is, a return to religiosity that had waned in the generations after Plymouth and Massachusetts and the Salem witch trials. To preachers of what became known as the Great Awakening, colonists had strayed from God, especially those deists. They had forgotten that they were a city on a hill. And maybe because of that, God had withdrawn his favor from the colonists. And that meant that they needed to get that favor back or else pay the ultimate price from God: death and damnation. But to the preachers of the Great Awakening, the faith of the colonists, it wasn't dead, it had just fallen asleep. Americans needed to be shaken out of their sinful stupor and to engage in a great religious awakening. Sense the name now? Preachers like George Whitefield, seen here modeling his Princess Leia style of wig, and Jonathan Edwards, seen here giving his biggest, brightest smile, these people delivered ominous sermons to the masses around the colonies. And perhaps none was more famous than Jonathan Edwards's Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God sermon, in which he likened the sinners' souls to that of a worthless, decrepit spider dangling by a single thread over the pit of eternal hellfire and damnation. And for the Hamilton fans in the room, it's worth noting that Edwards was the grandfather of none other than Aaron Burr, which sort of explains the line, "My father was a fire and brimstone preacher, 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 but there are things that the homilies and hymns won't teach you, teacher, teacher." And the Great Awakening had an important influence on colonists. First, it led to a lot of evangelical churches being founded across the country. And second, and perhaps just as importantly, it introduced people to the concept that individuals could shape their own fates by turning away from evil and embracing God. And that idea is revolutionary, for what if a society is unfair or unjust? Or what if a government is unfair or unjust? The individual is empowered, and you might even say required, to stand up for fairness and equality and righteousness, and to do so in God's name. So, whether it was by Enlightenment thought or religious pietism, Americans during this time period were beginning to see the flaws of colonial society, and they were beginning to take an active, personal role in improving their world and shaping their own destiny. And that was your bonus track. Hope you took great notes, and I'll see you on the other side of the screen.